Hello, everybody. Annie and Alex are here to tell you about the asylum process. We decided to build our interdisciplinary lesson around the asylum process for people entering through the southern border, people who are stuck on the border, people who have entered the United States illegally, and trying to talk about the experience of refugees going through the situation. Um, our goal is to reach into the third space, allow students a window into a process that's covered very frequently in the news, but isn't all that well understood. Since we're integrating Spanish and social studies, it seemed fairly obvious to talk about immigration, since the vast majority of people entering the US through the southern border with Mexico are Spanish speakers, and it would be an opportunity for us to flesh out the lives of these people and perhaps have an opportunity for empathy with them. So to talk about the tasks that are within the um, presentation, we are mainly focusing on um, the simulation and role play. There's a small bit about concept formation and a brief lecture, but our goal is mainly to have students act out the roles of a person entering into the United States and a lawyer trying to help them out. As a language lesson, it works because language is learned in the process of doing other things generally. And so I want to talk briefly about the objectives, where the objective for social studies is for people to be able to describe the process of admitting refugees to the US. And for the Spanish,
Yes, so the language objective, the state objective in particular, talks about conversational ability and ability to answer questions in kind of an unscripted way. So to be able to sort of spontaneously respond to things, which at this level requires a number of different verb tenses. And so in my objective from the lesson, I included the fact that students would be able to speak not only in the present, but also in the preterite and imperfect to talk about the past, because during the simulation, they'll be talking about their, the experience of their character, have whatever their life was like in Honduras or in El Salvador, wherever their character is coming from as well. And so that hopefully will be sort of an authentic chance to practice language, not through just reading a script, but through actually answering spontaneous questions.
The Department of Education social studies standard that we're working with is to evaluate the application of the principles and ideals in contemporary civic life, talking about liberty and freedom, justice, equality. And all of these are major factors since, as we've seen in the news, that there's some debate as to whether or not people who are going through this process have even the right to that. And so it is able to have students learn through empathy the ideas of democracy and justice in a hands-on way. So
I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, go on.
It's just that there's a lot of misinformation out there kind of regarding immigration as well. And a lot of people have a very oversimplified idea about how the process works. So I think part of the idea of the social studies lesson also is to talk about the different dimensions of, who gets to be an asylum seeker and why, and how that process is kind of defined in ways that aren't maybe obvious to people.
Absolutely. So now we're going to transition to the meat of the lesson itself. Would you like to take the first stab at that?
Sure, yes. We have this warm-up activity that's going to be based on a reading that students will have done the night before. So this is the Spanish class in this simulation, in this activity would be a relatively higher level one, probably about Spanish 4, at the point where they could read a short excerpt of an authentic news source in Spanish and be able to understand it and talk about it at some level. And so I have three articles that the class would be divided into 3 groups, and each of the students would read one of those 3 articles that deals with the experience of a migrant approaching the US border what their backstory is, what their, what happened to them on their journey, that kind of thing. So that will be their assigned reading before the class, just to kind of both practice their language skills, their reading skills in Spanish, learn maybe some relevant vocabulary that will be useful during this lesson, and also just get an understanding of people's personal stories as well.
We have
So as a warm-up
included those. We have included those
yes.
with the lesson plan, right?
Yes, they're in the lesson plan document. So there are links to each of these. There's one from a newspaper in Guatemala, one from a newspaper in Mexico, and one from the Los Angeles Times that's in Spanish. So they're all in our lesson plan Google Doc. They're also, I believe, linked in one of the later slides in the presentation here as well, if anybody wants to take a look. So as a warm-up activity at the start of this class, students will be partnered up with somebody who read a different article than the one they read, and they'll just have a brief couple of minutes conversation where they sort of summarize their article, and they each share one thing that they thought was the most interesting or surprising from what they read, just to kind of get them thinking about the stuff we're going to address in the lesson.
At this point, we move into a discussion of the asylum process. This is the meat and potatoes of the social studies aspect of it. So we're just beginning with concept formation. We're trying to define what makes a refugee different from an asylum seeker, from an immigrant. Students are asked to brainstorm these differences. They should come up with some ideas based on their own experiences. Hopefully we'll have some preconceptions that are wrong that we're able to correct. But even if they get it all perfectly, we'll be able to use that as a nice foundation going into the lecture, if you can advance the slide once or twice. Mm-hmm. So here we give the actual terms and a bit of a description of their definitions, as well as we're beginning to integrate the Spanish into it. So an immigrant, el inmigrante, or un inmigrante, etc. You can keep advancing it. Our goal is to have the students really think about what it is like to be in the shoes of these people. And so we're taking the source readings and we're having them see the process through the eyes of these students. You can advance it again. And so our goal is to look at how these systems and these personal stories tend to conflict. Our goal is to have people understand, hey, immigration is not just something to make farmers in Iowa get angry. It is a very real process lived by everybody and affects real people who have these very powerful and moving experiences. You can advance it again. So we then transition away from talking about just the life of immigrants and refugees, and we start moving into talking about what political problems are standing in the way of the acceptance. And so hopefully once we get into the actual language lesson, people will be able to incorporate that in their understandings and what kinds of pitfalls to avoid. You can advance it one more time and then I'll probably be done. So I look at the political explanations of what particular factors impact what refugees are considered to be refugees and which ones are refused that label. And though I don't get into the outcomes for it, there are very poor outcomes that we are capable of talking about should the question come up. And then we move on to the language part.
Yeah, so after the lecture, after they have some basic background in how this process works and what kind of standards you actually have to meet to qualify for asylum, we're doing a simulation that, as Alex mentioned before, is going to be a conversation between someone acting as a lawyer who's trying to help either one migrant or a group of migrants build a case for asylum. And so before doing that, they would obviously need some vocabulary to prepare them to have a conversation that has some sort of legal specific words in it. So as you can see, There are some of these here in Spanish that would be useful. We also laid out, there are actually more of these questions listed in the lesson plan document as well, but these are just some examples of kind of, the lawyers will get a little brief as well that will kind of help guide them through the conversation. So based on what they learned, these are things they might want to ask. Are you, why did you decide to come here? Are you afraid to return to your country? Why? And then this one is obviously really important and something that would be covered in the social studies lecture. This idea that to claim asylum, you have to be able to show that you've suffered harm or persecution because of your belonging to a certain social group, which is something that can make it very hard, specifically for a lot of people coming from Central America right now, because the US government doesn't recognize like widespread mass violence due to gangs as like persecution due to being a certain social group. And so the system is kind of stacked against a lot of people who do have a reasonable fear of violence and danger at home anyway. So that would be something important for them to be aware of before they go in. So as a sort of, using the simulation as a strategy, obviously it's really important to give them sufficient information beforehand, which we've done through the pre-class reading, through the social studies lecture, and then also through this vocabulary. So at this point, they should have enough tools to go into this conversation. And then for the actual conversation, we would split them into 2 to 3 students to a group. It would depend on the size and number of kids in the class. And I have a couple of sample briefs that that students would use based on the size of the group. But as we said, one student will take the role of the lawyer who will be asking them questions about their backstory. The students who are playing the role of migrants will have a brief that sort of lays out some things about their background. You're, whatever, you are, say you're a coffee farmer from Guatemala and you had previously been able to make a living like this, but due to falling price of coffee and climate change, like you can no longer support your family, so now you're here. Or say you work somewhere where you are being extorted by gangs in order to continue doing your work. You feel that your family is in danger. You can't, go about living your life anymore because gangs are threatening you every day if you don't pay them a significant portion of your income just to keep doing your job, that sort of thing. And so they will have those briefs. They'll have a couple minutes to obviously read through them and ask any questions before they begin the activity. The lawyer's job is just to learn the migrant story and ask them questions in order to help them build their best possible case for asylum based on the facts that they have. So that simulation of that conversation will run for 3 minutes that we'll be timing. Depending on how the timing of the class is going, it would be great to have them switch groups and each take the other side of the conversation. Just, for language reasons, they would get to practice both being the one asking more of the questions and the one answering them, which obviously are different kind of skills within a conversation as well. But if they don't have time, they would just sort of run through it the one time, and then we would come back together for the debrief, which, oh, there it is, okay. So another really important part of using a simulation or role play activity is to debrief afterwards so that students are really conscious of how the material ties back into what they're supposed to be learning. And so we would discuss these questions as a class with whatever time is left. A couple of groups, a couple students would answer, do you think that the migrants in your situation would be likely to have their case accepted based on the social studies lesson, based on what you now know about how that works? Why or why not? And then asked to reflect on whether they personally think that that's fair, regardless of what the legal system says. Do they think that law is really fair on a personal level? Obviously, there won't be time for everybody to share their feelings on this stuff during class, so they will have a short reflective writing assignment that'll just be turned in at the start of the next class. It would be graded only for completion. It wouldn't be, but it would just be a chance for them to kind of think a little bit further on those questions and also process any feelings that may have come up for them during the simulation, because obviously this is fairly intense subject matter that may bring up a lot of emotions for people for a variety of different reasons. And on that note, we do have a number of sensitivity measures that we want to take both before, during, and after, because obviously, as Alex mentioned, this is a topic that's become very controversial. A lot of people have very strong feelings, and we would want to make sure that we could teach about that material because it's really, really important, but without making the class environment feel unsafe for anybody. So the idea would be beforehand, we'd want to check in with any students who we know have a family or personal history or connection with recent migration to the US. If those students didn't feel comfortable doing this simulation and wanted to opt out, they would have the option to complete a writing assignment instead, where they, after the social studies lesson, would sort of reflect on what they know about the asylum system and sort of summarize it and do so in Spanish as a language activity. And, you know, do they think that it's fair? What do they think could be changed about the way it works? And then as a whole class, you would just want to, before doing the lesson at all, you'd want to make sure you kind of review class sort of standards of behavior around respecting other people's experiences, that it's okay to disagree, it's okay to have different perspectives, but it's never okay to attack somebody personally just because you think their idea is wrong. And also to just be respectful of the fact that you're talking about very real experiences in real people's lives. This isn't like a hypothetical, and there may be people in your class or in your school who do have personal experiences with these things, so take it seriously. Obviously, during the simulation, we'd be monitoring to make sure people were you know, staying on task, taking things seriously. And then, as I mentioned, the debrief also allows students to kind of share any like emotional reactions or thoughts that they had about the activity. If they don't feel comfortable doing that in front of the whole class, that's completely fine. They can use the written reflection to do that instead. So that would be, yeah, the end of the lesson there. These are some of the materials. They're linked here. They're also linked in our lesson plan. And also in the lesson plan are some samples of the briefs that students would have just to prepare them for the simulation, just to give them like what their backstory is as a migrant or a family of migrants.
Role plays are very, very good for giving students a sense of ownership over their learning. They're able to really inhabit the body of whatever character they've been assigned, which is enormously useful for their ability to take in information in new and interesting ways. So psychological research suggests that people learn more about a given subject the closer they can relate it to themselves. But on the flip side, we need to be sensitive to if it gets too close or too personal, then people can feel discomforted or even shut down. And we need to be respectful of that. And that's why we have spent so much of our effort and time talking about ways that we can modify it to make sure that students are able to get the most out of the lesson.
Definitely. And that would be a matter also of just knowing your students well in general, right? Knowing where problem areas could arise, people who have maybe personal connections to this material, that you'd want to be mindful of not putting them in a difficult spot, of course.
Of course. So we'll be taking questions on a Padlet, right?
Yes, there will be a Padlet. And yeah, let us know what you think, any feedback, any questions. We definitely welcome it. So thank you.
Thanks so much for bearing with us.